all seen the complete desperation of Afghan people trying to escape their country before the Taliban officially takes over. And the reason we've seen this is because of the wall-to-wall coverage these images have been given on a lot of Western news media outlets. Essentially, this war in Afghanistan was a NATO war. It wasn't just America, and so there was a lot of countries involved in it who are now pulling out along with America. But like their reasoning for pulling out and like their views on the withdrawal and the war in general is very different than how it's being represented in American media. There's a lot of generals and strategists and politicians coming on the news and talking about how embarrassing this withdrawal is. I think these talking heads are using this embarrassing withdrawal as sort of like a distraction from the fact that they were the people who gave the advice to four administrations to stay in Afghanistan for as long as they did with no results. If you look at how European news outlets are reporting on this withdrawal, they are laying to bear all of the problems that America caused during their occupation of Afghanistan for 20 years. So looking at the media representation from different countries of the same event can kind of give perspective of like what people really think of America right now and what that means going forward in like geopolitics. So it's kind of crazy to think about it, but like I was in kindergarten when America invaded Afghanistan, and now they are withdrawing and I'm a few years out of university. So literally almost my lifetime, America has been at war with this country. And I feel like as America was withdrawing, there was a lot of conversation about why they got into this war to begin with. So was it a nation building effort? Were they trying to go in and protect the women and children from Taliban rule? Or was it just imperial America just trying to export democracies with their guns and money? Realistically, it was just out of fear. It was really nothing else. 9/11 had just happened. They knew Osama bin Laden was responsible for it. And there's also intelligence that he was hiding out in the mountains of Afghanistan, which at the time was controlled by the Taliban. So they just went into Afghanistan to get him. It took a long time, but they got him. And they just stayed in Afghanistan ever since. Post 9/11, there was definitely like media encouraged overconfidence in the American military and a sort of like World War II nostalgia of like America gets attacked and then they enter a war. And so back then, going into Afghanistan was about eliminating the threat of another terrorist attack on American soil. But when they got into Afghanistan, it didn't take them very long to overthrow the Taliban. It was just that like after they overthrew the Taliban, they weren't able to establish like a stable democratic government that they could then leave the country and know that another terrorist organization wouldn't take it over. So we'll discuss the American media representation of their withdrawal from Afghanistan first. Essentially, when I first started hearing about like Kabul falling or the Taliban taking over, it was sort of like confusing to me because I was watching it on CNN and they're usually like left-leaning. They were obviously like visibly happy when Joe Biden won the presidency. So for me it was kind of like interesting to see them critique Joe Biden the way that they were critiquing him, because that's not very common for CNN. When I started researching this video, I learned that like there might be like political bias in media organizations, there might be political bias obviously among politicians, but in the military class, like it's very bipartisan support for the war in Afghanistan. So like all of these people from the military class were coming out as talking heads on media outlets, and they were all like going against Joe Biden's decision to withdraw from Afghanistan. Probably because they were the people that were giving advice to the four administrations that had overseen the war in Afghanistan to stay there. So like critiquing the withdrawal is sort of a way of distracting from the fact that they were the ones who created a situation in Afghanistan so that a withdrawal would look this bad.
In your view, was it a mistake how the U.S. withdrew from Afghanistan, or that it withdrew at all?
Well, there are two mistakes at work here. The first is the strategic mistake of withdrawing, which Biden made, but which Trump fully supported. Had Trump been reelected, he'd be doing the same thing. On this question of withdrawal from Afghanistan, Trump and Biden are like Tweedledee and Tweedledum.
So basically what I got from the media coverage just from like the first round was sort of like Joe Biden had campaigned as being anti-Trump. If Trump was disorderly, Joe Biden was going to be orderly. And yet when you look at this withdrawal, it's kind of like, Joe Biden, you're not governing the way you said you were going to govern, and you're not being better than Trump. Like this is something that had it happened under the Trump administration, they would have just chalked it up to his character, and Joe Biden was supposed to be different. So how is this happening underneath him? Kind of like bashing Joe Biden. They kind of implied that it was embarrassing for the US to leave Afghanistan in this fashion. But what's actually really embarrassing is that in the 80s, when the Soviet Union was occupying Afghanistan, they imposed their own communist government, Soviet Union-backed communist government in Afghanistan. And when the Soviet Union was forced to leave, that communist government actually held up for a couple of years after they left. And now you have America, who was occupying Afghanistan for 20 years, spent $2 trillion, and their American-backed government, democratic government, could not even hold up before the US could leave. That's what's embarrassing. I also remember like some commentators trying to talk about the rights of the women and children left there and how their lives would be under the Taliban control. It's really interesting to hear people of like that stature, like high up in the government, talk about their concerns for women and children, because I specifically remember another set of women and children leaving their countries for American values, chasing the American dream. They just happened to be on this side of the pond and also able to walk through Mexico to cross the American border. So it's very interesting that like you would be more concerned about the rights of women and children on the other side of the world where they can't get to you, but like women and children who are escaping violence, they're actually a problem. There was also commentators who were talking about Biden's legacy. Like the guy literally hasn't even been in office for a year and they're already bringing this up. But essentially they were trying to shame him. Like, do you really want to withdraw and like stain your legacy when you could just stay? Everything is like, the underlying message is like we should have just stayed in Afghanistan instead of experiencing this embarrassing withdrawal.
For us to have taken the short-sighted view that the United States should walk away and that we wouldn't suffer any ramifications, no fallout from this thing is just astonishing to me. Better to have stayed.
So the other thing that I noticed in the commentary was like they would have military people on to give a military perspective. And as they were critiquing the tactics used to withdraw from Afghanistan, they were interweaving that with like the sentiment of like anti-withdrawal. Like, you botched the withdrawal and like we should have just stayed because it's less embarrassing. And to like fortify this argument, they would sort of like guilt trip the viewer almost into like considering the military when they talk about withdrawal. So like all the people that died in the war in Afghanistan, like did they just die in vain because now we're withdrawing? Or all the 20 years that we spent in Afghanistan, was that were those 20 years a waste because we're withdrawing? Or they would critique the government and say like, this is the greatest military that ever existed in the history of the world, so if they're botching a withdrawal, it's not the military's fault, but like the government is not giving them proper orders for them to execute their withdrawal properly. So again, more distractions of what the actual problem is, by focusing on the execution of the withdrawal. So yeah, I just feel like the American media was like hijacked by this like class of generals and military strategists who just didn't want to admit that all of their years of advice had led to literally a situation where it was either we stay there for another 20 years or we withdraw in an embarrassing fashion. There was really no good way of leaving Afghanistan because of the situation that the US had created over 20 years. I think that's what's driving Biden's decision making right now. Like, he is president now. When Osama bin Laden was killed under the Obama administration, he was only vice president. And I read that like he was one of the few people in the administration back then who wanted to leave Afghanistan after killing Osama bin Laden. Obviously, that didn't happen. They ended up staying, and now that he's president, he's like, no, this is what I want to do. The world is a very different place today than it was 20 years ago. 9/11 happened, it was crazy, and they needed to eliminate that threat right away. That makes sense, but since then, China has been out here planting seeds all over Asia, all over Africa, positioning themselves to be a world power. And this whole time, America's been fighting multiple wars in the Middle East and like falling apart internally. America's in a position right now where other countries are looking at them and asking like, are you really the superpower? Are you really like who you say you are? Because it doesn't look like it. Biden following Trump's withdrawal plan is just him repurposing funds and like focusing time and money back on like issues that are relevant to this decade instead of wars that were picked and chosen 20 years ago. So it's still very obvious that a lot of the people in the military class still believe in this post 9/11 American superpower like ideology. But like America going around the world and trying to impose their own ideals onto other countries that they don't understand. But then when you look at their own house, like they can't even accomplish their ideals with their citizens. Like it's not cute at all. So now we'll move north to my country in Canada. Yeah, didn't really have much of a huge military presence in Afghanistan. Like this was really like an American withdrawal. Like there were some Canadian forces, but obviously like not enough to critique their withdrawal. Like it wasn't really our mission. There wasn't really much of a discussion about why we got into the war in Afghanistan, because we get into every war that America chooses to pick around this world. And what's really interesting is that the day that Kabul fell to the Taliban was the exact same day that our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, called an election, which is just very unlucky timing. So we're halfway through the election right now, and a lot of the discussion has been about the bureaucracy that these Afghan people had to face to try to get to Canada. Because essentially what the conversation has been like is Trudeau messed up the evacuation because he didn't make it easy for these people who worked with the Canadian military to get to Canada after the Taliban took over.
Nobody was able to recognize them.
Maruf is an Afghan interpreter who worked with the Canadian Special Operations Forces. He and his wife and 5 children, ages 8 and younger, were called to the airport 2 days ago by the Canadian government. The Canadian government is telling people to wear red and yell Canada to get through the gates. Maruf says he yelled for nearly 36 hours.
What was happened to Canada? Canada is my favorite country, and I have worked with them, and I know their honesty, their ability. What was the reason that they were so far away from the management?
So I guess you could say the Canadian embarrassment or the Canadian debacle is all of the Canadian allies that were left behind in Afghanistan, and the opposition parties are using that to make Trudeau look bad. Like his administration didn't really care about these people because they didn't streamline the visa process.
The Liberals have faced intense criticism of their response to Afghanistan. Too slow, too little, too late. And while the Liberal leader continues to make his way across Canada, there's no sign he'll be able to leave this issue behind.
Like it is bad that they didn't streamline this visa process for the Afghans that were helping our military. But at the same time, like we just do what the US says for us to do. Like these opposition parties saying they were gonna do something different, like I highly doubt it. There was actually also a lot of coverage about what the lives of women and children would look like under Taliban rule.
No matter what the Taliban says, it is what the Taliban does that horrifies. For women and girls, there is real panic that gains they've made are about to be erased. You're not afraid of people coming to your location? I'm trying to imagine what it would be like, and I can't.
We already have been through so much drone attacks, civilian abuse, government abusing you, Taliban abusing you. So you, in your head, you have already through so much trauma that you need to stand up so that the trauma doesn't continue.
When you hear some news reports describe the new Taliban, what goes through you?
Now they know how to speak English to the news channels, maybe.
And also like people coming on talking about like what the average Canadian can do to help the situation. But yeah, Canadian media, like honestly, if it wasn't an election, I'm not really sure how they would have covered this situation because there wasn't really much that we were involved with outside of just helping the US, which is our normal role. So now moving across the pond to the British media representation of the American withdrawal or Western Allies withdrawal of Afghanistan, they were not happy, like not impressed at all. When 9/11 happened, Tony Blair was Prime Minister of England, and he was like the first foreign official or foreign like power to come to the States and like talk about 9/11. And like Tony Blair and George Bush kind of went into this war together. They went into the war on terror, the war in the Middle East together. And outside of the US, the British forces had the most deaths and soldiers in the war. So like for America to now come and like unilaterally decide that they're just gonna leave Afghanistan on August 31st with no consideration to any of its allies, whether that be Canada, England, or any other EU country that was in Afghanistan with them, it kind of just like blows up their whole like Brexit plan, because essentially like their whole Brexit idea was like, yeah, we're leaving the EU, but we're just doing it so that we don't have to like follow their rules, we can make our own rules, and like they were gonna leverage their relationship with the US and Canada and create better trade relations there. But now having the US so like publicly just like not consider the UK in their decision making kind of just makes it feel like, okay, well, the UK needs the US more than the US needs the UK. And like, to be fair, the US has always benefited from the UK military because it's very organized and they have really good intelligence, and they're also willing to use their army. And the British media is not letting this go easily. Like, I remember watching a segment on the BBC, they literally just hired 2 angry Americans who just like ripped apart the US withdrawal. Like a lot of the same commentary that was happening in the US, just like for a British audience.
As a former ambassador to Afghanistan, are you ashamed of what Joe Biden did?
I am deeply saddened and ashamed.
And a lot of the messaging coming out of the UK is sort of like, America's not the superpower that they said they would be. America has abandoned their role as like the leader against the war on terror. They've abandoned their leadership role in general on the international stage. And like we as England, we no longer need to like look to them for guidance, but never really guidance because like they always consider themselves, you know, the mother of America because, you know, they were a colony first. But more so like the UK just needs to like create their own footing in the international stage and like to hell with America.
And as this all played out, the former head of UK Joint Forces Command, General Richard Barrons, argues we've relegated our security and prosperity and our interests to the will of US national politics.
And it was actually on European media. Like I've heard it on both English media and French media. The first time I heard about ghost soldiers. So like watching all of the North American news that I've watched, I haven't heard anything about the corruption that's gone on in Afghanistan because of the US occupation. But as soon as you watch European news, it's like all laid out to bear for you. Like apparently there were a bunch of like military generals in the Afghan army who would like create fake soldiers on their payroll and then just collect their salaries. But like, so like you would think the army was 300,000 people, but really it was like maybe 60,000. And then the generals were just making money off of these fake soldiers or ghost soldiers. That was the first time I heard about that. You don't hear about that on American news, I can tell you that much. So my absolute favorite media to watch about the Afghan withdrawal is French media, because I just feel like it was very, very in-depth and very insightful. Like North American media, whether it was Canada or America, it was very like visual, like they were looking for visually impactful clips of the desperation and then just talking about that. But in France, like they were talking about government corruption. They were showing maps of Afghanistan and showing you like where the Taliban took over, where they like had been reduced when the US first invaded. They were talking about ghost soldiers again. They were also talking about like how Taliban makes money by selling drugs, which I didn't know. And of course talking about whether or not the US is a superpower or not. So I think from a French perspective, like France is one of the heavy hitters in the European Union. Like they have one of the stronger economies, them and Germany. So they kind of call the shots when it comes to like making decisions for the EU. And also Europe is going through a very polarizing debate about migrants. Obviously they got a lot of migrants or refugees, frankly, from the Syrian civil war and now this Afghanistan situation. So there's a lot of paths that they can take to get into Europe. And so like the French president actually came out and said that he's gonna like think about this migrant situation very seriously. Which is in stark contrast to other countries that were like, we're gonna accept 25,000 Afghan refugees or 30,000 Afghan refugees. And he just came out and was like, we're just gonna look at the situation very carefully. So for the French, like they also have a little bit of skin in the game because like they had a colonial empire with ties to the Middle East, I think mostly in Syria, if I'm not mistaken. But like they have ambitions for like creating their own international alliances in North Africa, Africa in general, and also in the Middle East. So like their situation with the Taliban is not done the way that the US is like talking about like this is like a clean break for them. Like he has things that he wants to accomplish in that region, whether the US is gonna be there to support or not. And I think the US withdrawing like this, like not talking to their NATO allies and just making this decision unilaterally has strengthened sentiments in the EU about like, again, not looking to the US to lead the way in certain like global issues. And so if you're gonna project America as no longer being a superpower and no longer being like a country that France should look to for leadership, like they're representing the withdrawal from Afghanistan a lot more thoroughly than American media, and that they're literally laying to bear all of the things through the 20 years that the US occupation led to, or like created a situation where withdrawing like this was the only option. So as I watched French media, I learned a lot about like the Taliban and what happened to them when the US kicked them out of power in the early 2000s. Like they kind of retreated to the rural areas, and obviously like there is a rural divide in Afghanistan, as there is in a lot of countries, between like the city progressing faster culturally than rural areas. So like the Taliban and their like Islamic State rule didn't really bother people in rural areas, because like they were kind of already living in this like very like Sharia law type culture. It was only in the cities where that was not a thing. And so when America took over and was changing a lot of things in Afghanistan, like a lot of people in the rural areas didn't like it, and so they supported the Taliban, and they were like helping them maintain a certain base of support until they had this opportunity to take over again once the US left. Another thing that I noticed in French media was a lot of discussion about how the US created and propped up a corrupt Afghan government. And so essentially there was a lot of situations where like the US was just paying warlords to like build schools, or they were paying them to like not go to war with other warlords, to like kind of fake this instance of like there's peace, when really there wasn't peace. It was just people waiting to get their paychecks. And so obviously when you take that out and you take that away, then like there's no reason for them to not go to war, or there's no reason for them to cut a deal with the Taliban to secure their own profits again, right? So now that the US has left, media coverage in France has sort of focused on like the military equipment that the US has left behind in Afghanistan. And so sure, the US might have like destroyed it, like broken glass, taken the engines out or whatever, but like that's still a lot that they can use if they learn how to fix it, you know? Like, sure, there are people out there who will help them fix it for their own purposes. So yeah, if you really want to get an anti-American view on this withdrawal, I would highly recommend French media. So that concludes my little tour of the world media representation of the US or Western ally withdrawal from Afghanistan. So obviously it's very interesting to look at media representations from different countries of the same event, because it tells a lot about like how regional differences can affect the representation of an event. And also like there's a lot to be said about what the US is going to do next, what they're going to focus on next, now that they're not you know, leading in the wars that they have led in the past. So let me know in the comment sections what you guys think of the different countries' media representations. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.